I mean, I guess getting a little bit more of a sense of what, either sort of what background you guys have in Bolivia, recent Bolivian history, or what you know about Bolivia, other than the fact that Evo Morales is president, and or, why you wanted to come here, what you kind of wanted to understand. And I don't know if a couple of you want to talk or sort of go around in a circle, just to have a little bit of a hold on sort of where you guys are coming from, so that I can speak a little bit, because there's sort of so much. So if I hear a little bit more about what you guys know.
Let me just try to summarize briefly. Obviously, we wouldn't be here if Evo Morales had not been elected. It's a unique situation in Latin America of an indigenous movement being successful and an indigenous president being successfully elected, and what that means to governance. So clearly we're interested in what role social movements had in that, what role they have now. I mean, in Brazil it was fascinating to be there right before the PT took power, because if you're talking to MST and everybody else, they were wondering sort of what their position would be if all of a sudden an ally from the coup was president of the country. So we're sophisticated enough to understand there are likely to be tensions. We saw this in South Africa and the coalition between the labor unions, the Communist Party. There are tensions. There still are tensions. There are pressures for the labor federation to go out of the highway stuff. What does that mean? What do the miners' strikes all mean? What has happened in terms of the cocoa growers' base? I mean, this is, we gather there's been recent tensions. How do we understand those in relationship to this? But really the role of social movements is, that's where we're hitting. Now, there'll be other questions, more sophisticated, but since most of us have been involved in unions and community organizations, it's really what role the unions play. There's traditional unions, are there autonomous unions? This current dispute is confusing to people like me, because it seems to be one set of organized miners against another set of organized miners, government in the middle. I need a way to understand that. I want to know what happens if you really do bring dynamite on a march. We don't do that in most countries.
Well, maybe then I'll start sort of where I was leaving off, because it's fairly pertinent to this discussion. I mean, I did a lot of community organizing, and from when I was in high school and throughout college, and even a bit afterwards. And the reason that I stayed in Bolivia was because I arrived in April of 2005, right before what they call the Second Gas War, which maybe you guys heard a little bit about today, which was the 3-week-long protest in May and June of 2005, where essentially, El Alto did its stranglehold on La Paz, and that's what catalyzed President Mesa resigning, who had taken over from Goni before, and that's when elections were called for December, and Evo won. So I had arrived, a month before, and then spent, those 3 weeks every day on the street, sort of watching what was going on and talking to people, and was completely blown away by what I saw here. I mean, it was like totally outside the concept of anything I'd ever seen in the United States. Like the amount of, not just, everything from organization to mobilization, and how completely empowered people feel here with respect to their government. I, was very frustrated in the States, and maybe for this was one of the reasons I haven't gone back, is there's sort of a sense, I think, amongst a lot of people that government are the leaders, are the rulers, as opposed to here, where it's essentially the people are the rulers, and government is there to do what people want them to do. And if they don't follow what the people on the ground are saying that they should do, then they get kicked out. It's sort of like as simple as that, and it happens on every scale, from neighborhood organizations, where if your dirigente is not doing what he's supposed to be doing, then people have a little revolt and they switch him up, to the president. I mean, Bolivia had they forced 5 presidents to resign in the span of 2 years. it's Goni and then Mesa, and then there were three other people that resigned right after him to bring the head of the Supreme Court to power. So it's this totally, it's the concept that we're taught about democracy, but it actually, to some extent, is practiced.
Direct accountability.
Right.
And
this is not to romanticize it at all,
right.
because now you have a situation where, okay, your friend is in power, so how do you deal with that? And I'll maybe get to that in 1 second. I'll start a little bit more with kind of how Evo got to power. But so that's what fascinated me about Bolivia, and that's why I decided to stay. And so, I think Evo should be, well, certainly he was, one of the main political leaders and organizers who had a role in this sort of wave of protest from 2000, which started with the water war, and you'll hear more about that in Cochabamba, so I won't even go into it really, and ended in 2005 when he was elected. And a friend of mine who lives in Cochabamba has an expression, which I think is pretty accurate, that Evo was the one who caught the wave. He wasn't the person who created this giant movement and then got into power. He was the one who got to take advantage of it. He and the MAS political party. The other thing that I found fascinating about Bolivia, still do, but it was more in that sort of early period when I was here, was that I had also, growing up in the States and doing organizing and all of that, I had a very sort of Western trained mind in thinking that taking state power was the ultimate goal, always. Like, what could be better than that, than like gaining power in the state and being able to then control things from above. And here, I started seeing that there are a lot of people who don't think that way, and a lot of social movements. There was a lot of, there was conflict, and there still is, but there was a lot of discussion before Evo came to power of like, okay, social movements are very cognizant of the power that they hold over society, and it's just oftentimes because they can blockade roads and stranglehold the paz and all of that. But there were discussions amongst them of like, what do we do with this? They could have toppled the Mesa government much earlier than they did, I think, but they often kind of pulled back because I think for a lot of groups it was like, wait a minute, do we really want to take hold of the state apparatus? Is this going to get us what we want? Is this the world that we want to, or is this the way we can bring about the change in this country that we want? And there are some people who you guys are meeting with Oscar, and I would assume he'll probably sort of touch on this, that because it's one of the reasons why he didn't go into government after he didn't accept a ministry post that Evo desperately wanted to offer him, was because he didn't think that taking state power was necessarily the right decision. So that's just sort of to keep in the back of your heads here, that like, yes, from one perspective, like, fantastic that Evo got elected, man of the people, first indigenous president, still so connected to the social movements, but it's taking state power has its limits, and I think that's what Evo's living now, because since then, we've had kind of different cycles. It's in a fairly conflicted one at the moment. But I think that sort of like what you were saying about South Africa or any of these countries, or Brazil, where you do have a friendly government, it creates a lot of conflict. And here in Bolivia, Evo's first job had to be to pacify the social movements. I mean, they were the ones who made the country ungovernable for 5 years. And so if you suddenly take power, you need the people who make the country ungovernable to quiet down and to calm down. And so, Evo supporters would say, it's not pacification, we simply, sort of became the government. And so therefore there's no need to protest as much because, we have all of these other mechanisms for realizing our goals and for bringing about, the things that we want. And those who those on the left who don't necessarily agree with Evo would say, no, it was a program of trying to pacify and literally trying to co-opt all of the social movements into the government so that you wouldn't have, miners versus miners and the Tipnis revolt against the highway, and because that's what makes Bolivia ungovernable. And Evo, at his heart, he's certainly, has a very respectable political history, but he's a politician. I mean, he's there. He wanted to be president for many, many years. He's president now. He wants to keep that power, and he's going to do what he can to keep that power. Again, those who support him would say, no, but that's fine that he wants to stay in power, because then, this country can move down the road it should with him in power. And others then would say, well, the problem is he cares more about being in power than actually making real change in the country.
We heard that earlier today as well, talking to people.
Yeah.
Saying, hope in the beginning,
right.
Now consolidation.
Exactly. And so it's been, the first few years after Evo was elected, were sort of quieter, I would say. You didn't have a lot of the, kind of conflicts and strikes and blockades and everything that you're seeing now. And I think now we're at this point where there was so much expectation about, what he could do. And there's certainly been, some change. He's instituted some good programs. I mean, some of them are just straight up social welfare programs giving, stipends to school kids or the elderly or, pregnant and new mothers. Literally just, sort of cash in hand to people, which does something, particularly in a country as poor as this one, and it makes people happy. He's done some stuff in land reform, literacy campaigns, the nationalization of the gas, obviously. But in terms of kind of large scale, structural change, Bolivia is not that much different than it was, 6 years ago, 7 years ago. So now you have a situation where I think people are just kind of frustrated by the lack of change and kind of just saying like, well, screw it. Like, okay, yeah, we know Evo's our friend, but if he hasn't delivered for us yet, then we're going to go back to the same tactics that we've used before against every other government. And that's, here, blockades, strikes, dynamite, whatever it is. And so you see, all sorts of just like every sector of this society having their own little revolt, or at least trying to. I mean, in the last 6 months, we've had the strikes of everyone from the doctors to the police to, the miners' conflict now, the Tipnis March, the taxi drivers. I mean, every sector you could possibly imagine is just kind of throwing up their arms and saying, well, we want this. And it's been hard for the government to keep kind of a hold on it and a lid on it. And I would say, sadly, at least like from my perspective, coming from a background that you guys are all in, I would say, the social movements were 100 times stronger, 7 years ago than they are now. It's a lot. It's just, from what I can see, having a friendly government, one of the results is a weaker civil society. And okay, maybe a weaker civil society is okay if there's like a lot of other change or compensation that you're getting in return. But to me, it's that question, it's that balance. Is it weaker because there's not as much to fight for because the government is doing a better job, or is it weaker because leaderships of social movement organizations have been completely co-opted because all of because what's happened is, and it's sad, even places like FEJUVE or a lot of these incredible and powerful organizations have just sort of been like stepping stones to government posts and wanting a salary from the government because that's the mentality, and it makes sense, it absolutely makes sense that if you were marginalized from not just sort of the the decision-making structure, but from all of the benefits of being in power, whether it's like being able to get a government salary or, you know, being able to give your brother or your cousin a government salary. If suddenly those doors open, everyone wants in. It's, you know, it's natural, it's human. And so, yeah, a lot of these groups have been, they've just sort of kind of like merged with the government itself, which, you know, at least in my perspective,
and that's true of labor unions as well as
yeah, I mean, you know, it depends, but yes, you know, I would say neighborhood organizations are sort of more susceptible to it, but but with all of the large social movement organizations, again, like the government strategy from the beginning was like, we got to keep these guys under control. You know, we gotta and to be fair, you know, there are some people in the government who believe that that was actually the way to bring about better change. Like, of course, we're going to bring the leadership, you know, of the miners into the government, because then they're going to be the ones that get to make policy. But that gets messy too. You know, you have folks who have spent their entire lives, you know, working inside a mine and knowing what that reality is, and then transitioning to being in a place of having to like think about and design and put into place public policy is really different. And there was a lot of kind of conflict between folks who had worked in the government before and who had sort of that, even that sort of technical or administrative kind of know-how, able to do a lot of cleaning of house, since you have a lot of new people coming in and having to practice skills that they don't necessarily have much training in, which is hard too. So it's kind of a messy panorama at the moment. I mean, yes, miner stuff, you know, is a perfect example. So there's a mine that's owned by a transnational corporation named Glencore, and the government decides, okay, we want to nationalize it. We want to, you know, or we want to take it away essentially from the company. But then you have these two. Bolivia has a very weird mining sector, and so you have like essentially the miners who work directly for the government, called the asalariados, like meaning they get a salary directly from the government, and then you have what are called the cooperativistas, cooperatives, which is a completely misleading term because they're just like small little businesses. There's very little cooperativeness about them, and in most cases exploit workers even worse than any other groups. But they're called the cooperativistas, and so if it takes the mine away from the transnational, there's like one very, very wealthy vein inside the mine, and now it's a fight between, you know, who gets to work that vein, essentially, like who gets the good place in the mine. How much? Mine is it? It's tin and I think some, what's the spaniel? Zinc, I think. I've also been out of the country for months, so I haven't been keeping up on it as much as I should have. And while you would think like, oh, well, of course, you know, it's the government, he's going to side with the government system of mining, it's actually not the case. The cooperativistas are sort of a much more powerful bloc in Bolivia, and Evo needs their support and has always relied on them, and they've always come through for him. So if anything, you know, he's more likely to give them better concessions than the asalariados.
And is that's the result of the mining nationalization, would be to take this mine and turn it over to the cooperativistas?
Or, well, that's the decision now. Either you turn it over to the cooperativistas or you turn it over to sort of the government mining sector, Comibol. And right, what they're talking about now is a split. You know, some they'll mine some, but there's like this one specific vein that's going to give most of the profits. The question is who gets that. And so you have miners, you know, in the street, literally like throwing dynamite at each other. I mean, miners use dynamite in every single protest possible. But normally it's just kind of for the effect. Like they plant it on the ground, everyone makes a big circle, it blows up, and it's just kind of just a demonstration of force. And this is actually literally like throwing it at each other. And so as a government, what do you do? Like, you know, what does Evo do in that situation?
Were they both involved in the mining before, the Cooperativistas and the...
No, because before it was owned by a foreign company.
Okay,
so they had their own,
involved.
exactly, they had their own, they had their own workers. So
why would the groups organized by workers who get paid worse and are treated worse, why would they be a more powerful bloc?
There's more of them. There's many, many, many more of them, and it's just, you know, it's their sort of livelihood. It's their side of it. So yeah, that's kind of the situation. I don't know if that clarifies anything at all.
Have there been many deaths from all this
Speak up.
dynamite throwing? Sorry, have there
There
been...
was one death a couple days ago.
In the union office?
What's that?
In the union office?
I think so. Again, I haven't been paying much attention to
It's
the
like
details.
Thursday,
So
and I think it was a Cooperatista threw it in the union office. So there was one death, 9 injured.
and again, like these things, like it's sort of, you know, my not paying that much attention to it is somewhat just because it's like, you know, it's like strike fatigue. Of just like every week there's like another one of these things, and so I pay attention to it somewhat, but you know, in my own work I've moved a lot on from covering politics here. First of all, because no one cares that much, and if I write for outlets in the States, you know, they don't have that much interest. And it's just like so many years of the same stuff where, yes, this week's with the miners and who knows what it's going to be next week. And it's just kind of a lot of repetitive themes.
So maybe if there's no other questions on that or beyond that, you know, I was going to ask a little bit about the role of the military. What kind of influence they have, where Evo stands with them. Like we know, like Chavez in Venezuela has like a pretty good relationship, right, with the military. One of our taxi drivers was saying there was one of the ministers that's in charge of the military is kind of controlling Evo to an extent. But Evo has pretty strong support from the military itself, and that's, you know, looking at the history of Latin America, it's like that's pretty important to have actually for a progressive government, right? But it has its pitfalls too, right? So, and where do they stand here?
Yes, it's absolutely necessary. You know, this country, it's only been it's only been democracy since '84, and so yes, you have to. Any president right now has to have, you know, sort of the tacit support of the military, just sort of period. That's a weird comment by the taxi driver, because the Minister of Defense right now is certainly not within Evo's inner circle. There was, you know, there was more talk several months ago at the military, because again, one of these little uprisings was the police, and they were angry because they were saying that that the Evo government was favoring the military over the police, and they wanted police salaries raised and all of that. And it may sort of be true, because the fact is, like, he has to, you know, he's got to keep them happy. It's one of the reasons why, you know, Evo hasn't committed yet to not send more people to the School of the Americas. And part of that is because, like, top military guys like going there. You know, it's like a reward that you get. And so he hasn't been willing yet to.
So they're currently doing that still?
I don't know how many people are there now. I think what they said was they weren't going to send any new people, but there's still like some people there and doing like return courses. Like he sort of made some public statement as if to say exactly, it's a grandfathered in clause. So yes, you know, Evo certainly has the support of the military. But the military here, you know, Bolivia is a funny country in that, yes, you know, obviously there was a dictatorship. The military here had lots of power, but often it's kind of described as like a dictatorship light. I mean, if you compare it to Chile, to Argentina, I mean, you have none of the, sort of atrocities that were committed. And in general, in Bolivia, it's a very, for all of the kind of social unrest that you have, in the end, it's not a very violent place at all. I mean, Bolivia's worst massacre, in the past 10 years is the gas war of 2003, where 67 people died. 67 people. I mean, that's like, 3 days in Colombia in the war with the paramilitaries. It's like a weekend in Ciudad Juarez in the drug war. I mean, it's nothing. And this is like the biggest catastrophe in 10 years in terms of, real violent conflict within the country. And so, there's criticism of Evo from some folks that he doesn't push the military to turn over files about, human rights abuses during the dictatorship periods. And again, he's not going to do it because there's not a ton of sort of popular, push for that, because certainly there were some people who were tortured and who were disappeared, but very, very, very small numbers, and it's more important to his government right now to keep the military on his good side. And I have to say, to the military's credit, so in 2005, in the second gas war in May and June, you have, so the person who was president was Carlos Mesa, who's the vice president for Goni, right, who was kicked out in 2003 and who fled to the United States and has been living there ever since. So Mesa was the vice president, and he resigned on June 6th. The person who was supposed to take power would have been the president of the Senate, a guy named Armando Baca Diaz, who was one of the most right-wing, radical people in the entire government. And they did polls at the time, and he would have had like 4% of the country's support behind him. So he went to the military and asked them basically to create a civil military government for him, because he knew that there was no way that he could keep power without the military backing him. And the military said no, because they knew it would be a bloodbath. They knew that there was no way to bring someone like that into power and not have to violently repress a lot of people. So the military said no. Baca Diaz had to resign. Then the person, the head of the lower house of Parliament, the Diputados, was also kind of this right-wing guy, not quite as radical, but still right-wing, and he also knew that he would last about 24 hours before he got kicked out too, so he resigned immediately. And then they brought in Rodriguez Belce, who's the president of the Supreme Court, and when it gets that far down in the line of secession, you have to call general elections within 6 months, and so that's why you have the elections in December, where Evo won. So, to their credit, the military,
sort of responsible.
Exactly, they didn't want to go to war against their own people.
I'm trying to picture like a group of U.S. workers like shutting down I-80, and I'm pretty sure the military would come in and clean things up pretty quickly if that something like this happened in the U.S. So why isn't the military involved in stopping the bloqueos?
Because of 2003, that was what Goni did in the bloqueos in October of 2003. He called in the military, and that's when you have 67 people dying and 400 people wounded, that's what made Goni fall. Was that Bolivians, again, it's not a violent culture. Everyone, like across the country, middle class, like folks from the Zona Sur. The Zona Sur is like the sort of richer section of La Paz. They even though they maybe agreed with Goni and his policies, and certainly didn't want an Evo Morales as president, when Goni started calling out the military and they started open firing on protesters, everyone came out in the streets in protest, and that's why Goni resigned. There's just sort of this sensibility amongst the Bolivian population of like, we're not going to allow that. we're not going to allow the military to come out. And Mesa was extremely smart. In 2005, in the protests in May and June, he didn't call the military out, and that's why you only have one person who died in sort of a strange incident in Sucre at the very end, but you don't have any deaths. Because the problem with the military here is that there's mandatory military service for men when you're 18. And so a lot of what it means is you're sending like 18-year-olds out into the street who, to do, and obviously some other officers, but the bulk of who you're sending out there are like teenagers who are completely untrained, whereas the police force is, for all its problems, at least it's a trained force. And so all of a sudden you have just like these kids basically, and Bolivia doesn't have any, military conflicts everywhere else in the world. It's not like they're getting actual training in fighting or in crowd control or in anything like that. And so all of a sudden they're thrown into these situations where, there's 100,000 people marching at them, or there's, angry as hell Alteños who are burning tires and who have sticks and stones and throwing them at them, and they just, you get scared and you start shooting. So Mesa was very smart in 2005 and didn't do that. And you have, the military hasn't been called out since then.
I mean, another thing kind of I've heard over the last couple of days, like a division between progress in the campo, in the countryside, versus lack of progress in the urban areas.
That is, I would say that's definitely accurate. Evo, so Bolivia, the other thing that, that I found remarkable when I first came here is the other thing, coming from the States, I completely took for granted the state presence in our lives, roads, lights, police force, just all of these things that are part of your daily life in the U.S. That in a lot of places in Bolivia just didn't exist. I mean, there are corners of this country, and much more 7 years ago, where there was just no state presence, zero. The state did nothing for them. There was, no sort of security forces, there was no sort of, infrastructure, there was no water, there was no, and if there was any of that stuff, it was because people just built it themselves. They dug wells, or they built their own road, or whatever it was, but the state just did not exist. And so one of Evo's concerted goals when he came in was to expand the state presence. And depending on where your politics lie, you can think that's good or you can think that's bad. But he really tried to just, get the government out there and do projects in the campo, whether it's like building schools or building hospitals or roads or, drink potable water lines, whatever it is, just like try to reach those areas that beforehand had been, pretty much providing on their own, and try to give them some state help and state presence. So there has been, I would say, a much more concerted kind of effort and focus to improve life in the countryside. And some of it has been done with state money. It's been done with a lot of Venezuelan money. Venezuelan. It's been done with, help from USAID, from the Germans, from the Italians, from the Spanish. It's certainly not all government money, but it is, an effort to bring the state in to provide more state support in very, very rural areas. And so yes, for the past several years, there's been this sort of general frustration from the cities where they feel like they've been neglected by the Evo government. Because so much attention has gone to the countryside. I would definitely say it's pretty accurate.
Is it accurate sentiment, or is it accurate actuality?
No, I think in actuality, I mean, I don't know the details of it, all of the government programs that they've tried to put into place, but but just kind of, you know, from living in La Paz and going to different cities, you don't sort of feel that much of a difference. Whereas if you go out into the countryside, yes, there are notable things. And it may just be because it's so much easier, you know, like if you go out to the countryside and all of a sudden there's all these villages that have drinking water provided by the government, that's huge. Whereas like you can, you know, it's much harder to make kind of that drastic of a difference in city lives, I think. And I do think it's accurate that it was, that again, like, you know, it was Evo's goal to really get the state out there, and so that's what he's been doing.
Has that stave, I would assume that one of the benefits of that would be to stave off the waves of migration to the cities because people can't support themselves in the campo anymore.
Right.
Has that infrastructure helped keep people where they are, or does that not really?
I don't know, it's a good question, I'm not sure. You know, certainly like in Bolivia you have that migration, but I think you have it less than in a lot of other places. I think there's, in part because there's a lot more sort of self-sustainability in a lot of the rural areas compared to other countries in the world where you already have sort of more market-based economies, and then people struggle a lot more, and so they have to move into the cities. And you still have a lot of places here in Bolivia where they're pretty removed from the market. So I don't know, you know, I don't really know the migration numbers and whether how that's been impacted by Evo's policies, but it's a good question.
Do you know if there's any like resentment in any of the rural areas of the sort of encroachment of the state?
Yes. I mean, I think there certainly is when it comes to issues around justice and policing, because you have, you know, if you live in a community, or not even just like a tiny community, but in some of like the, you know, communities out in Altiplano where you have thousands of people, you know, in sort of a centralized area, whether you call it a village or a town or whatever it is, they have their own way of going about things, particularly when it comes to disputes and legalities. And so, you know, they call it community justice, and certainly a lot of it, you know, is based on centuries old sort of practices about how you handle any sort of infraction. And some of that, I think some of the community justice stuff is really fascinating and really cool, and has to do with kind of retribution. And, you know, if you steal 3 sheep from me and we figure it out, then you have to, you know, work on my farm for a couple days to pay that back. But you also could get 3 lashings. So there's definitely corporal punishment involved there too. And it's, you know, you don't have a system of judges or people who are separate kind of designated deciders. You have like you have the dirientes, you have a group of men normally who run things in the community, just kind of like a council, and they're the ones who decide. And so, you know, if she's my best friend and she gets to decide what your punishment is against me, maybe she's going to give you a harsher punishment than she would if, you know, she was a third-party person. Right. So there's, you know, it's a complicated system, but it, you know, it worked for them. It's what these communities have used for years, and then all of a sudden you have police forces coming in, you have, you know, people going in saying, no, there need to be lawyers, and there needs to be a jail set up, and there needs to be judges, and the justice system here is a complete mess. And I think a lot of it is because even, you know, this is sort of the more recent stuff that I'm talking about, but I think in general, people see and feel the justice system here as a complete Western imposition, which it was. And again, you take a group of people who the only, like, what they've always been taught and what they know about how to resolve disputes is this sort of familial system, you know, of like, we'll talk about it, we'll figure it out. Yeah, maybe you're going to get a lashing, maybe you're going to pay back some, you know, crops with your next year's crops because you owe something to this person because you stole something. And you come in and you tell them, no, really what's going to work is, you know, there's going to be someone who you don't know who's going to talk for you in this weird room where all these other people who you don't know either, who are just randomly selected, who are going to make a decision about your life, you know, and then there's this one guy who like controls everything. It makes no sense. And so it was, you know, it wasn't trusted from the beginning, and then it became very corrupt and whatever. It's a whole kind of long side story, but certainly I would say like a lot of the tension in bringing the state presence you can see in that arena.
How good an economic shape is the country really in?
Depends. What are mineral prices today?
Yeah, and that's worrisome. I mean, that's exhaustible resource.
Yes. Bolivia, I did a piece, I can forward it on to you guys. I think about when it was. I guess I wrote it in 2010, so it was, you know, talking about sort of how Bolivia had done in 2009, so the first year of the global crisis, and they actually had the fastest growing, according to the IMF, the fastest growing economy in all of Latin America.
Wow.
And a lot of it was because,
Brazil.
a lot of it was because commodity prices were high, and a lot of it actually came down to the fact that Evo is somewhat fiscally conservative, oddly enough, and was, you know, had a large amount. I mean, Bolivia has a large amount of money sort of stored, and it was funny. I talked to all of these economists across the board, you know, conservative guys and left-wing guys, and they were all saying the same thing. They're all saying the government needs to be spending more. It's like it's not spending enough money, you know, doing public works projects and creating jobs and all of this. Yeah, it was fascinating. It's a totally fascinating article, right?
You didn't see that coming.
Exactly, not at all. But yeah, everyone was, you know, just sort of criticizing him for being too fiscally conservative and not spending enough. And then the government in their defense said, well, you know, we're just sort of saving up and we're going to spend it soon. And so yes, Bolivia's economy depends a lot on how commodity prices are. But it's also, it's just, in some ways, the fact that it is kind of, other than commodity stuff, fairly cut off from the greater world market, and that, you know, it's not relying on sending its goods to the U.S. or to Europe to sustain it economically. And so suddenly if you have, you know, a downturn in the U.S. or Europe and they don't want that many goods, it has a huge impact here. The fact that it's just, it's not a big producer of anything in terms of manufacturing or anything like that was somewhat beneficial, because then when the economy changed, things didn't change here that much. And you know,
that's also neither for better or for
right,
worse kind
exactly.
of thing. Talking about a subsistence economy that can go on. That's fascinating.
You know, almost 80% of Bolivia's workforce is in the informal market. You know, only 20% of workers here actually have contracts. So it's just, you know, the majority of the people are the folks that you guys have seen walking around these past few days. They have their little stall, they're selling something, they have their little, you know, taller, their mechanic shop, or, you know, just something kind of small, and they're making some money from what, you know, they get paid on a day-to-day basis. So it's still, you know, it's still, if not the poorest, you know, the second poorest nation in South America.
What would the poorest be?
Sometimes they say Paraguay is poor, but I haven't seen recent.
Include all of Central America, it's usually Nicaragua.
Yeah, if you include all of Latin America,
So when you
Haiti.
read World Bank, IMF, it's for Nicaragua, then Bolivia, whatever.
Right. So yeah, economically it's doing so, I would say.
Incoming.
So are there a lot of exports like within Latin America?
This is?
Not a whole lot. I mean, you know, soy, sugar, quinoa.
Yeah, we're talking about quinoa exports. It's kind of a big deal.
let's see, what else do they? I mean, you know, all of the minerals get exported. I mean, and all of the value added goes someplace else.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, is there any like processing that goes on there at all?
No, I mean it's quite extraordinary. So you guys know Potosi, the Cerro Rico is like essentially the world's oldest and richest mountain. They've been mining that mountain since for 500 years exactly.
500 years or whatever, yeah.
Exactly, and it's still standing, although only barely. Could collapse at any moment. And so for 500 years you've taken probably, I don't know how many, I couldn't even guesstimate how many billions of dollars worth of silver, gold, zinc, tin, copper, everything. And there's not one smelter in the entire city. No government has ever gotten it together. They built one time. So when you go into Potosi, you see it, but something was wrong. It never became operational.
That's crazy.
So it's little things like that where.
And they've always not made any moves in that direction.
No,
right?
I mean he talks a lot about industrialization of minerals and value added, and we're gonna not just be an exporter of raw materials anymore, but very little has been done.
Has anything been done?
In terms of
actually working in that direction?
Yeah, they're building a couple plants to process liquid gas, process natural gas into like liquid gas. I don't know if they're up and running yet though. So yeah.
How does the nationalization work? So like with this mine that was just taken over, like do the companies that get kicked out, like are they trying to sue the World Bank or anything?
It depends. It's totally sort of on a case-to-case basis. I have no idea what Glencore's going to do. No idea. I haven't read whether they've made any statements yet.
Mm-hmm.
When the whole...
Somebody's trying to buy Glencore, though, right? Somebody in Canada?
I don't know.
Nothing I'm aware of. I know in Canada there's a sort of a takeover from a Chinese, like a national Chinese company of a Canadian company called Nexor or something like that. So it might be, but I don't know.
And when Evo did the nationalization or sort of nationalization light of the gas in 2006, there were no lawsuits because it wasn't actually a nationalization. It was just essentially a renegotiation of contracts. No one was, expropriated or anything like that, so there was no need for the companies to sue.
I read that Bolivia has between 65 and 70% of all the lithium on the planet, which is sort of a key ingredient in sort of emerging high-tech economy.
Yeah.
So one would think that Bolivia would be in a position to drive a hard bargain on pricing.
Yeah, here's the lithium story, and it's probably the thing that I've reported on most since I've been here, and actually
this is a moneymaker now.
I'm producing a documentary on it as well. Yes. Underneath Bolivia's very remarkable and majestic Salar de Uyuni, which is the largest salt flat in the world, there's anywhere between in that salt flat and a couple other small ones, anywhere between 50 to 75% of all the world's lithium. Probably up to 90% is held like within what's called the lithium triangle, which is actually like a section of land on the Altiplano that happens to be divided between Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, and Bolivia happens to have the lion's share of that. But it has never and still has not it had never. I guess in the mid-90s, a company came in called Rathke from the U.S. and wanted to try to develop the solar and start producing lithium carbonate, which is the raw material that you get from lithium and that you can then export. It's a powder. They had some problems, including the fact that the people from the area were not happy about an American company coming in and trying to develop their resource, so that company went over to Chile. Right now, Chile produces, the lion's share of the world's lithium. And the fact is, right now, the world doesn't need a whole lot of lithium. It needs very little. Chile throws away about 3 times as much lithium as they even sell, just to be able to keep the prices what they are. Because right now, lithium, all of you guys have lithium probably on you right now because it's what powers your cell phone batteries, your laptop computer batteries.
Cameras, yeah.
It is, it's the best, it's the lightest metal, and it's a tremendous energy sort of resource, captivating resource. So the interest in lithium as of late is the fact that it's now very clear that the lithium-ion battery is the best battery for the electric car. They tried with nickel, they tried with, all sorts of different things over the last, decade or two, and hands down the car industry is going for lithium-ion. So in 50 years, if we're all driving electric cars, we're going to need a hell of a lot of lithium, and the world is going to need Bolivia's lithium. And so, several years ago, Bolivia started realizing this, and to their credit, I think are, doing it well, and said, we're not going to, sell a chunk of the solar to some foreign corporation and have them come in. We're going to do a state-run enterprise to try to make the lithium carbonate on our own, and then eventually we want to industrialize it. There's essentially 5 steps between lithium carbonate and having a lithium-ion battery, and so they want to do at least the first couple. Bolivia says now they want to make the batteries, but we'll see. We still haven't quite gotten lithium carbonate yet. So the project, the pilot plant out on the solar has been in the works for years. There's a lot of scientific reasons why, even though Bolivia has a lot of lithium, it's more complicated than that. It's not quite as, it's scientific stuff. It's complicated by the presence of magnesium, which means it's a longer process in separating the magnesium out to get pure lithium carbonate, et cetera, et cetera. It's not quite as easy to work the solar as it is other places. And so what?
They're not actually producing.
Nope, nothing, 0.
Jump right to the bottom line.
Exactly.
0.
But right now, it doesn't matter that they're not producing. Even if they were, it wouldn't be bringing in very much money. There's more lithium out there than we need, and even just in Chile alone, they could, as I said, produce and do produce way more than the world needs. It's really just going to depend on our global transition to electric vehicles, how quickly that happens. It's going to depend a lot on whether they figure out the technology to recycle lithium-ion batteries, because it's not like having 80% of the world's oil,
Right.
because it's you're not like you're going to be pumping lithium into your cars. You make the battery and there it is. And so if they figure out a reasonable and cheap technology to be able to recycle those batteries, again, Bolivia's lithium may be totally inconsequential in the long term as well. They should get in on the market, and I think that they will, but it's been a slow process.
Sarah, pass those napkins, please.
But it's fascinating. If you want, I can forward you on some of the stuff that I've written on it.
Yeah, please. Why do you think that there's such strong social movements? Like, is there something culturally different about Bolivia where
In the water.
people are willing to take those steps and
I've been
push it?
asking myself that for 7 years and still have no answer.
Well, at least it's a good question, Corey.
It's a very good question, and I just don't know. I mean, yes, I'm sure it has something to do with, particularly in Aymara territory where we are now, where sort of cultural traditions, some historians would tell you the Spanish, their conquest of Bolivia was very different than in other countries. I mean, I didn't study Latin American studies or Latin American history at all, but they kind of left a lot of the indigenous populations here alone. They didn't care that much, as long as they worked inside their mine or worked their fields, they just kind of like let them be, which I think sort of came back to haunt them because it meant that they, the communities were much, much stronger. There was, several uprisings that almost, unseated the Spanish back in the late 1700s here. I mean, they were put down, but they were very, very strong, and it was kind of a result of the fact that the communities remained intact and were able to organize as well as they have. So, I don't know. All I know is that maybe you guys should start bringing in Bolivian miners in your protests.
Yeah,
might be
seriously.
a bit more effective than the US.
Get Americans to stop being so nice all the time.
We were talking a little earlier about Naomi Klein has a chapter in her book, The Shock Doctrine, where I don't know what president it was, but they imposed a lot of austerity measures heavily on the country. And eventually that also gave rise to EVIL and the Coke Growers Union and some of the social movements as well.
Absolutely. Bolivia was a total guinea pig for structural adjustment and all of those programs. And I think it backfired on them. Absolutely. Yeah.
And what about